One of the questions we get all the time is, Chris and Bryan, can you recommend a great way to do cross-development? You want to write code for Windows, you want to write code for Linux, you want to write code for the Mac, you want to write code for your handheld device. Well, so we've decided to kick off a multi-part series of cross-development tools. And we thought, what better way to start this than to check in with our own resident expert, Bryan. So in this episode of An In-Depth Look, it's part 1 of cross-development. We're going to get into the in-depth look of cross-development environments and give you some best practices and maybe some pitfalls in just a second. But first, we've got a great deal from our buddies over at GoDaddy.com.
That's right. This episode of An In-Depth Look is sponsored by GoDaddy.com, the world's largest web host and domain registrar. Starting at less than $5 per month, web hosting from GoDaddy.com includes 99.9% uptime, 24/7 support, and free access to GoDaddy Hosting Connection, the place to quickly install over 50 free applications like WordPress, like Joomla, like Drupal, like OS Commerce, and so much more. Plus, as a listener of In-Depth Look and viewer, enter code Linux 749. That's Linux 749, all uppercase at checkout, and get your .com domain for just $7.49 per year. Some restrictions may apply. See site for details. Get your PC internet now at GoDaddy.com.
Nice. Thank you, GoDaddy. All right, like I mentioned, we have a resident expert here. You know, Bryan has just been you've been digging into just building a ton of apps recently.
I've been cranking.
You've been a code machine.
That's what I've been doing. Yeah. It's called being out of work is what it's called, and it allows you a lot of extra time to do the things that you've been wanting to do for a while anyway.
But here's the thing. I think all of the applications you've made are either already cross-platform or have the potential to be cross-platform.
And they're all cross-platform at this point.
Okay.
Everything I'm making is for Linux as well as Windows and in some cases Mac as well.
I'm going to call you out, and you're going to hate me for doing this. I say for the viewers and the listeners, discount.
What do you mean discount?
Discount for our fans. You should hook everybody up watching with a discount for your apps that you've been making.
But I want more monies.
I know you do, but you know what? Let them see what you've been making. You'll make money. You might even sell more because you did a discount.
Let's get this out of the way so we can dive into the meat and potatoes of what this video is supposed to be about. All right, so if you haven't seen my applications yet, there's Radical Codex, an ebook and comic book reader, and organizer and device syncer and all that sort of thing. Yeah. And there is Radical Comic Designer, which lets you lay out and create new web comics and that sort of thing. The Radical
Comic Designer is definitely one I think people will really be into. Give me a URL and I'll post it in the show notes.
All right, go ahead and go to check out, radicalbreeze.com /
do a JB something so that it has to be Jupiter Broadcasting, like JB Store, JB Video.
All right, let's do jbvideostore.html. All right, give people a URL for that, and by the time this is over with, I'll put up a little discount and give everyone 10%, 20%, something like that.
Okay, so we've done.
All right,
we've let's see. Okay, you've done Radical. You've done 3 applications, right? Three?
Right. There's 3 applications, and there's 2 of them that I've done recently that were the entire purpose of them. Well, not the entire purpose of them, but the whole purpose of them could apply to any platform. So I've ported them to as many platforms as I can at this point.
Now, there's got to be specifically some challenges in trying to do that, right?
Oh, there's huge challenges with doing it. And what I thought I'd do is, since there's a lot of news happening out there in the developer world nowadays, especially from Qt or QT or however you want to say that, the folks over at Troll Tech Nokia, they've released their new IDE called Qt Creator. Right. MonoDevelop is making huge strides lately with MonoDevelop 2.0 is coming out. Eclipse, of course, is great. The Lazarus folks are doing good. The folks that make Real Basic are doing good lately. So basically, everyone's doing good and putting forth their A game lately. And the ground has changed. The game is different than it was a year or 2 ago when it comes to developing desktop and mobile applications.
Right.
So what I wanted to do is, and we'll talk about each individual IDE and developer tool in future segments, but right now let's just talk about some of the weird little gotchas and some of the benefits and pitfalls of developing a cross-platform application for each individual OS, for Linux, for Windows, for OS 10.
Yeah, exactly.
So the first thing I want to jump out to, and this is more than anything, is just going to be a big kudos to the Linux world. When you're developing an application, it is almost never isolated. No application is an island, right? An application always wants to do something with something. So let's say you have a video editor,
It's
right?
deep.
Or
That's deep.
let's just say you're making a graphics editor. You want to be able to, let's say, convert between formats, right? You want to convert a JPEG to a TIFF file. Well, that's pretty easy to do, but just the same, on Linux, there are so many libraries and command line tools and scriptable
Right. Stuff you can
applications out
call
there
on.
that you can call on.
Gotcha.
And the great thing is, most of those applications are in every distribution's repositories. So when you
Ah.
create a package for a given application, you can just say, I'm going to rely on super special magic. Let's say Image Magic. Image Magic's a great one. Image Magic will let you convert between pretty much any graphics format and any other graphics format. And you
Okay.
can just simply call on it. Now, on Windows or OS 10, it's not there.
You got to bundle
There's no
something with your app.
You've got to bundle something with your app, which means it's much harder to
Hmm.
for you to build an installer. You've got to deal with DLL hell issues. You've got all sorts of problems. And on the Mac side, it's both simultaneously easier and even harder because Mac users don't even have installers. They just expect you to be able to drag a single file around, which isn't even a file. It's technically called an
Bundle.
application bundle. It's just a
Yeah.
folder that pretends like it's an application, and you drag it around, and sure, you can throw stuff inside your application bundle like all the tools you need, but then you run into licensing issues. There's all sorts of issues. On Linux, it is so much easier. So you'll notice when I released Radical Codex, it reads ebook formats,
Yeah.
and it syncs with things like the Kindle. So let's say I want to have the ability to sync a PDF file to a Kindle. A very cool piece of functionality. I
Sure.
want to have it. On
Yeah.
Linux, there's a bunch of command line tools in the repository. I make sure that the Debian or RPM packages grab those tools,
Okay.
and I call them from my application.
That makes sense.
On Windows, meh. On OS 10, meh.
You have to
much much bigger
distribute
than the
something
button.
with it.
You have to distribute something with it, or you have to roll your own functionality over again.
But
Basically,
doesn't
you end
that
up
mean
having to
if you
reinvent the wheel.
distribute with it, doesn't that mean you have more control over the end product? Because how do you know
Kind
Fedora isn't going to have an update that could break something that you relied on?
Right. No, that's absolutely true. But then again, that's the same thing that happens though on Windows or Linux or OS 10. You have no guarantee if you make an OS 10 application that Apple isn't going to break your application in a future revision. That's always going to be the case. So you develop
Mm-hmm.
for a specific version of a
Yeah,
specific operating system.
I
So if
see.
you develop for Fedora, you develop for Fedora 9 and Fedora 10 and
I
whatever the
gotcha.
next one is, and you make sure you have a custom package just for each distribution. So you make sure that your support for each distro is finely tuned.
Right. Okay.
Now, that's a lot of work though, which gets into the flip side of all this. In order to ship, so like let's say Radical Codex, my ebook reader,
Yeah.
one installer for versions of Windows, one disk image for OS 10. People just drag out the application and use it. 5 different packages depending on your distribution, one of which is just a tar file with instructions on how to install additional items from your repository.
Gotcha.
Now, while this gives a lot more flexibility to people and what they can do, it is a lot more difficult. So if you're a new user coming to Linux, installing applications is a bit more challenging because you have to know which version of Linux you're using specifically.
Right.
And that can be a little bit more of a pain. Now, there are things I could, of course, do to work around that, like put scripts on the website to check the OS version and download it and so forth. But that's additional work again that I have to do. So that is a major problem. But
Okay.
it's more than made up for by the fact that I have those
The
repositories
repos.
there.
Yeah. I can make that
Windows
makes a lot
and
of sense.
OS 10 need to have default repository things just like that out of the box because
Right.
oh my lord, the amount of time that it has saved me, it really shows through. The Linux versions of my applications
Get
have
features
more
first.
features
Yeah. Yeah.
because they're easier for me to make. When it is basically I need to put a cool UI on one extra piece of command line
Right.
or one extra library that I can call, of course I'm going to add it.
So that's
Even if
something.
it doesn't take me, even if it's not that big of a deal.
So that's something that's totally separate and independent of whichever development environment you might be working in. If you're
It doesn't even matter. It's just
Yeah.
a general consideration when you're developing for each of these platforms.
right.
And the same goes. So what that does though is things like if you wanted to be able to make a word processor or an application that edited word processing files on Linux, again, it's easy because you've got command line tools that will allow you to read open document files
Right,
and Word
right.
document files, plus scripts that'll automate OpenOffice and things like that. you got nothing on Windows or OS 10 except for the ability built in to read RTF files, which meh, it's not as cool. So Linux really does get the win there, but when you're developing cross-platform, of course you need that functionality across
Regardless.
everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it is a bit more of a challenge. Luckily, UI wise, when you were talking about the windows and the buttons and the drawing, that's actually pretty simple. That's
Oh,
actually the easiest part of all of it.
has that always
And
been the case?
no, not really.
Okay.
It's never been terribly difficult over the last few years, but it's gotten a lot easier.
Okay.
Specifically with Qt 4.5 and Qt Creator, they've done amazing things over the
Yeah.
last few months that just are mind-boggling. The Mono guys have done a lot better. If you're up for the Mono side of things, you can do C# development and whatnot. They've done a lot of great work, and Real Basic and Lazarus have all come a long way. Plus, there's a lot of UI frameworks like WX and whatnot, and GTK in general that you can use on any platform,
Right.
and they just work incredibly well. They're very
Yeah.
mature, they're very stable, and amazingly, they're even very well documented. And there's so much sample code out there that developing a good UI for a desktop application is actually almost a
Well,
no-brainer.
here's something.
You pick a toolkit you like, and it's probably going to work on all the platforms nowadays.
Here's something I found pretty interesting. The VLC VideoLAN client player for Windows is actually built. The UI is built with Qt.
Yep, sure is.
So that was interesting.
A lot of applications are built using Qt or WX widgets or GTK. I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, and here's the ridiculous thing, even WinForms. So the .NET the Windows Microsoft made .NET
Yeah.
UI framework
Right.
WinForms, because of Mono, that now runs under Linux and OS 10 also.
Right. But
So
there's
even the most, but there's the thing is sure we've got GTK and WS widgets and Qt and all these amazing frameworks, but even the what we considered at one point to be the most entrenched and platform specific set of frameworks is now
Gotcha.
incredibly
Yeah.
cross-platform.
Now there's
Very
there's some debate whether mono is the language to go with, but you're right.
Oh yeah,
For something
yeah,
that was
absolutely.
something
But
that was
yeah,
totally just like isolated is now also.
it's now everywhere.
Yeah, it's
is
very
is
cool.
basically the thing. Heck, you can run Mono applications with a UI on those little Nokia internet tablets nowadays. So I mean, that's a long way from
Right.
Windows XP only UI
Yeah.
framework.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so it's pretty astounding. So right. So what I also wanted to touch on, and I touched on this a little bit briefly, is just the installer format stuff. That actually came into play quite a bit. So let's say on the Linux side, because of the way packaging works, you can link to other packages with different license types very, very simply.
Oh.
And I want to make that very, very clear. So now I can say in one of my applications that it can utilize a other tool made by a third party, whether it's a GPL tool, LGPL, proprietary, or commercial, it doesn't
Okay.
really matter.
Okay.
But I can say it utilizes it. If you want to, go get the package for it. And I can put that as a reference inside the package. Now, on Windows and OS 10, none of that sort of thing is possible. If I want to add additional functionality via a third-party application or library, I actually have to include a separate download on my website that will allow people to download and install that additional
Why is
functionality
that?
because of the way because of various licensing issues, and so that
So
becomes
because
a real
under
pain in the butt.
Linux, it's a package calling it.
No. Here's the thing: is so if you create, let's say, a Debian package,
Okay.
and inside that Debian package is your application, and that application depends on or recommends another package, and with that additional third package would add functionality to your application. Now, if you want that
Gotcha.
same sort of functionality on Windows, you actually have to put a second or third installer on your website that people
Right,
have to
okay.
grab.
Okay. I've
Major
seen
pain
that
in the butt.
before. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. All right.
It's a major pain, and again, it does
But it's
lend
something you
itself
have to
very
do in
well.
order to release for those platforms.
It really is, and it makes you just want to give Linux a high five every now and then because
Okay.
it is pretty amazing.
I've sensed a lot of positive Linux stuff. Now there had to have been some negative Linux stuff.
You know, there have been some negative Linux things, most primarily 64-bit support. So now 64-bit has been a dubious thing at best for every platform. Now,
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
Mac people might say, well, there's no problem on the Mac side. Well, there is if you're a developer developing a number of different applications. Just most users are isolated from that problem. But there have been a lot of issues. If you have an application under Linux or Windows or OS 10, it can be 32-bit and run under compatibility mode in a
Right.
64-bit distro or
Yeah.
operating system.
Yeah.
But then it still requires 32-bit versions of those libraries. And those 32-bit versions of libraries in turn rely on
More.
32-bit versions of libraries.
Right.
And so, but you have a 64-bit distro and you're running a series of 32-bit applications. In the end, you end up with almost two parallel distros installed worth of libraries on your
Wow.
computer,
Right.
which the potential is, let's say you've got a 64-bit library over here that reads this file here, that's this microphone. And then here's the 32-bit version that also reads the microphone file. Well, now what if they're not exactly the same version and they treat the microphone file a little differently? Well,
Right.
then you have problems where this microphone file is corrupted now because one of the libraries screwed it up for the other one.
Right.
And normally this isn't a problem, but sometimes if with some libraries this can crop up. So this actually became an issue that I had to deal with a great deal over the past several months leading up to the initial release of Radical Codex. Was we had problems running on most 64-bit distributions because of problems with 32-bit compatibility libraries,
I see.
and that is a major, major downfall.
Now, I would also
So
just think from like just from a system standpoint, if you have two copies, if you have a 32-bit library and a 64-bit library, well,
yeah,
there are some like buffer overflows and things like that that could affect the 32-bit version and not affect the 64-bit version. So, right? Couldn't you have vulnerabilities in one type and not a vulnerability in the other type? Couldn't that be an issue?
theoretically.
It just seems like a big hassle.
Yeah, theoretically, no, it's a big hassle. More than anything, though, it's that you have different versions. It doesn't even
Yeah.
matter if it was different bits or whatnot. It doesn't matter. Having two versions of the same library on your system running at the same time, accessing the same resources, can lead to trouble.
Right.
And honestly, most developers out there are smart and do it right. However, it just takes one bug or two bugs among a few libraries to really cause havoc all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's gotten a lot better. A year or two ago, things on the 64-bit world were chaotic at best. But nowadays, they're actually pretty good, and all of my applications now you can grab and run on 64-bit Ubuntu or Fedora or
That's
whatever.
good.
But just the same, that still was a major issue. Now, on Windows and OS 10, not an issue at all. Now I released them as 32-bit only applications, but I just never had any issues. In part because they're closed systems, and by the time they're released by whoever makes them, theoretically they've tested them out and the libraries work fine.
Right. So now let me ask you this: was there anything you could have done differently to avoid running into the 64-bit issue that you did? I mean, is there nothing?
Oh,
Is it just the nature of the beast, or?
In part, it's the nature of the beast, but it also depends greatly on the frameworks and the tools that you're using. Now, without going into too much particular details on this, I want to save it for a future video because I have some things I want to get into there. If you are going to be developing a series of applications and you're worried about cross-platform issues and bit issues, I highly recommend going as open source as possible. And so making sure that not only the IDE is open source, but that the frameworks are open source, your installers are open source, everything. This is not just on Linux, but on Windows and OS 10 as well. The more open source you go on the development side of things, the better, even if you're developing commercial platforms.
Really?
Because that otherwise, and I know this argument gets made a lot for open source because, well, then, hey, if you have the source, you can fix your own bugs. Well, now most people obviously aren't going to go fix their own bugs,
I would
right?
never do that. No.
But in the case of developing an application where you're shipping, say, custom versions of libraries anyway, well, hell, it's kind of nice to be able to fix your own bugs or submit your own bugs back up there that hopefully get fixed.
That makes sense for a developer.
One case, okay, there's more cases, but in this case, it really makes a great deal of sense. So whether you're a Mono guy or not, Mono develops great. Qt Creator, highly recommended because you get the commercial support and the open sourcey kindness, and there's all sorts of good stuff. That's definitely the way to go on that side of things.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So
it's a lot of stuff.
This is so much stuff. We're gonna have to just break this down over several different episodes.
We are. And what we'll do is we'll cover individual development environments one at a time. Next up, we'll cover Qt Creator because it's the new bad boy on the
I'm
block
hearing
from
so much about
Qt.
Qt Creator.
It's pretty phenomenal. Honestly, I'm kind of pissed off that it wasn't released a few months earlier so I could have done some of my projects with this application because it's very,
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah.
We're also going to cover MonoDevelop because, hey, it's the one that everyone loves to hate, but it's actually pretty cool. We'll also cover Eclipse because it's kind of a jack of all trade IDE.
Okay.
People
Okay.
use it for PHP, but also there's a lot of great UI development going on in Eclipse.
All
I
right.
want to touch on Lazarus. It's been a while. It's been about 2 years since we've really talked about it, and it's been fairly quiet in the Lazarus world. But a few things are coming up, and I want to talk about it. We'll also talk about Real Basic, the proprietary kit on the block.
Okay.
So that way we'll just get a good coverage of all of them, what they're offering, and if you out there, you the viewer, have any recommendations or any things you'd particularly like us to cover, to talk about, to really dissect and dive into, definitely let us know, and we'll take it in consideration, specifically with a fully cross-platform IDE. By that I mean an IDE, a development environment that can run on at least two platforms and compile to at least two platforms. So simultaneously, so you can run on both. Same code, preferably, is kind
Right.
of what I'm going for.
Right.
So yeah, that's the gist of what I want to talk about
Very
today.
nice.
It's a very, very big topic, and my apologies if it's a very boring topic for you. You should be a software developer, then it wouldn't be quite as boring.
You
That's
know
all I
what?
have
It's
to
still
say about
interesting.
the
It's
topic.
like I don't know anything about software development, but I still find it educational. You know, I gotta say, if you haven't yet checked out Bryan's apps that he's worked, there's your blog. I guess they go to lunduke.com, but radicalbreeze.com.
You say that in a derogatory way. I guess they could go to lunduke.com. It's a bunch
that
of,
old place.
bunch of pile of poo-poo over there. Lunduke.com.
And I'll put a link. I'll get Bryan to do a discount for the viewers and listeners
Sure.
of this episode. And
Just because I love you guys.
and we'll put that in the show notes because that's going to be probably something you'll want to check out too, just to get a feel for what we're talking about. And also, they're kind of cool apps. They really are. Bryan
you
wouldn't
make me
admit
blush.
that, but I'll
You're
say
making
it.
me blush. You're making me blush. My cheeks. They're rosy here. They're rosy cheeks.
All right, hey, so
All right.
you
I
know,
also want one more thing I have
Okay.
to point out is the hat sitting on the desk behind Chris right now is just so Indiana Jonesy with the hat on the desk. I love that. It's freaking me out with how cool that is. Okay, whatever you were gonna say,
I
you
was
can
gonna
say. It doesn't even
say-
matter now that I've mentioned the Indiana Jones thing.
I was gonna say if people have suggestions, they should probably hit us up via Twitter. That's kind of like the best way to manage all of that,
Yep.
which is I'm twitter.com/ChrisLAS.
And I'm twitter.com/Bryan with a Y LAS.
Yep, and we're also on Identica and Plurk and all those. But
Same Bryan LAS and Chris LAS on all of
there
them.
you have it.
And if we're missing one, let us know. Because
Yeah.
what the heck, right?
Yeah.
We'll social network anywhere. We are social networking whores. That's what we do.
Yeah. All right. I think that wraps up this episode of an in-depth look.
I do believe.
If you're out there and you're shopping at GoDaddy.com, we really appreciate it when you use those codes. Remember, this episode we're throwing out Linux 749 to save you some money on a .com. So
That's
we really
right.
appreciate that. All right,
Good
everybody.
times.
Thanks so much for tuning to this episode of an in-depth look. We'll see you in a little bit, and keep it
Little bit.
geeky.